Welcome to part 2 of this video about giving a new life to an old ship model. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, just click on that little white tag at the upper right of your screen. Now, at the end of part 1, we left off at the main cabin, but it wasn't complete. So let's pick things up right there with the skylight. I replaced the original skylight. As with most everything else on this model, it would not have been suited to the Berry's new life as a museum exhibit. And I made the replacement out of boxwood and maple. I took the measurements right off the plans and referred to the photos for my target period for the layout. Off camera, I removed the bulk of the unwanted material with a drill. Once all the window shapes were refined, the components were given a light sanding and are now ready for assembly. And for this, I used my homemade assembly jig, which is actually nothing more than an old X-Acto miter box that I cut in half and epoxied together at right angles. It fits nicely in the pan of ice and keeps me square on the X and Y axes and plumb on one side for the Z axis. Very handy to have. Now the window frames are next. Simple rectangles glued together at the butt joints. 2 rails, 2 styles. We like simple. The next step is to make the battens that hold the bars over the window lights. Unfortunately, when I reviewed this footage, it was unusable. So for demonstration purposes, I reshot the segment. It's exactly the same process, just not quite so large this time. It goes like this. First, I determine the width and the height of the battens. I have an idea of the finished length, but I don't need the exact dimension right at the moment. We'll get to that later. I know I need 4 identical pieces of a specific width, and after some machining, I'm going to use the table saw to slice those blanks to that finished width. I also know that I'll be making those cuts with a saw blade that is 30 thousandths of an inch thick. Adding the thickness of the 4 battens and the 120 thousandths for the 3 saw kerf cuts gives me the overall width of the blank I need. And I've added in 50 thousandths for extra scrap in case I have to, in case my math was off. And the overall size is just a shade over 3/8 of an inch. I next work out the spacing for the 4 bars. And the first bit of machining is drilling the holes all the way through the entire blank. And at the drill press, I have a 32 thousandths bit in the chuck, and I've secured the blank in the vise, making sure it is perpendicular to the bit. And that's very important. Then I carefully and slowly drill the 4 holes. I take shallow cuts, clear the wood chips from the flutes in an attempt to keep deflection down to an absolute minimum. A couple of thousandths deviation is okay on a big piece like this, but if you rush it, you could end up being as much as a 64th of an inch out of alignment, and that would definitely render the piece useless. With the holes for the bars drilled, I can cut the contours into the ends of the battens. And here it's finally time to figure out the finished length. In this case, I'm leaving an 1/8 inch from the end of the first hole and the end of the 4th hole. And a little paring with the chisel, and it's time to go to the table saw. With a handsaw, I've cut the blank to its finished length. So now at the table saw, I have the fence set for 60 thousandths cut, and I run the blank through. And steel music wire is used for the bars. For this do-over, I'm just using brass, but I like using the steel music wire because it's tough stuff and it can stand up to a little manhandling and not bend or distort. So here you see me clipping off the excess after I've adjusted for the length of the bars that I need, and a little sanding finishes it off. Now there's no need to glue here. Everything will be fixed permanently in place when it's installed over the window frames on the skylight itself. Now I glaze the windows with clear plastic about 3/1000ths of an inch. It's my usual practice to use glass for this. I use microscope cover slides. But I didn't have any large enough for some of the windows, so in the interest of consistency, I used plastic all around. The steering wheel on the model was a white metal casting meant to represent the wooden helm of a larger sailing ship, clearly a commercially available piece meant for a different model. When originally built, the actual boat was probably fitted with a tiller, and the conversion to a wheel and gear system might have happened during the schooner re-rig. In any event, she had one during the period that the model now represents. It was a cast iron wheel with 6 plain straight spokes and simple wooden handles. I made this one from brass, and for the handles I used boxwood. As with the forward companionway, the wheel box was not very close to the dimensions on the plans, so I replaced it, taking the dimensions right off the plans and, of course, using photos from John Van Horn for the details. Now, the masts were surprisingly correct in diameter and length and taper, and they were fairly straight, so no need to replace them. And the only modification actually needed was at the mastheads. And using again the photographs of John Van Horn as my reference, I reconstructed the mastheads and the trestle trees and the spreaders and all the rigging hardware. I also made a new topmast. The original was not quite as straight as the lower masts. The original booms and gaffs were off in almost all their details and dimensions, so these were replaced. The Mystic Seaport plans I was using and the Van Horn photos supplied the details for size, shape, and means of attachment of the details like the jaws, sheet block, bridles, and other rigging-related items. Now for all the replaced spars, I used Degame, mostly for its scale appearance and for its stability. Sadly, I was not able to reuse any of the original rigging fittings. They were made from a lead-based metal, and some were showing signs of degradation, so new ones were made or bought. I turned new deadeyes from white holly. There were only 8 of these, so it was not a big job. I also replaced the deadeye straps and the shackles, making the new ones from brass wire and flat stock. New thimbles for the topmast shrouds were also turned and cut, and futtock shrouds and mast bands were made from brass. Now, there was nothing unique about the rig of the boat. As with the spars, I leaned heavily on the Van Horn photos for anything that might be out of the ordinary. And the only thing that even mildly qualifies as out of the ordinary is the placement of the boom tackles. Now, most vessels have them mounted on the underside of the boom. But from the Van Horn photos, it appears that berries were mounted on the port sides of the boom. So that's where I installed them too. And also in the photos, it seems she was rigged with all fiber. Now, I'm not 100% certain of this, but it does seem that way. I could see no obvious evidence of any wire being used. That's a bit unusual for a boat in the mid-1930s, but not completely unheard of. Now, all the rigging line I used on this model was either linen, silk, or cotton, in that order of preference. In the past, it was common model building practice to coat your rigging line with beeswax. The thought was that the wax would help preserve the line, make it easier to handle, and impart catenary where needed. And it would also cut down on the appearance of those annoying little hairs that are often visible after a line has been handled for a while. But in recent years, some museum conservators have come to discourage the practice, saying that the beeswax, as it breaks down over time, emits gases that can have a deleterious effect on the line it's meant to protect, and even on other items in close proximity. Is this true? And can the phenomenon be reliably measured? How does it affect the lifespan of the line? Many questions for which I have no answer. But as a precaution, I've stopped using it as a general practice, and I only apply it in very limited and specific instances. On this model, I used beeswax only on the silk thread that I used for the servings on some of the standing rigging. In terms of proportional use, I would say 1 to 2%, maybe, of all the line on the model was treated this way. Where the size of the rigging allowed, I made real eye splices in much of the running rigging. Doing this can be both frustrating and oddly satisfying at the same time. And when the lines were too thin for a woven eye splice, I used marlin splices. And the blocks I used were commercially available through Blue Jacket Shipcrafters in Searsport, Maine. Their blocks are made from a proprietary alloy called Britannia, which is purported to have none of the ills of the lead-based white metal castings found in the majority of commercially available parts and kits. And the castings are high quality, and the pieces themselves are accurate to scale. And, speaking of scale, when determining what size blocks I needed, I noticed in the Van Horn photos that some of the blocks looked quite outsized for their purpose. Specifically, I'm talking about the head sail halyard blocks. They appeared to be very big for the size line that they would most likely be asked to handle. Now, I didn't think it was a perceptual illusion caused by the angle of the photograph or a distortion of the lens. The blocks look that way in a couple of different photos as well. Without being able to determine the reason for this, I thought it best to stick to the visual evidence and make the blocks a bit larger than I normally would. The end result was they really don't look that much bigger. Bayhead Historical Society wanted the model to have sails installed, and they wanted them set. Now, during the period we're concerned with, the berries seem to most often favor a three-sail rig: a mainsail, a foresail, and a staysail, or a jumbo. Now, there is one photo showing her with a jib as well. That's close to our time period, but I think it's later. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that the berry carried the sail earlier, too. So I made an artistic decision and chose to show the model with the fore, main, and jumbos set and the jib furled. I laid out the pattern for the sails full-sized, based on the new set of spars, and I chose to make the sails from silk span rather than cloth. Even at this large scale, I find cloth sails to be unconvincing in appearance and generally uncooperative in handling. Silkspan is a non-woven paper, and the sheets that I'm using are very thin, roughly 1.5 thousandths. It handles easily, readily accepts paint and glue, and can stand up to being wet down when furling a sail. Now, I only recorded part of the process for this project, but I have made videos that deal with the subject in depth, and I'll provide links to those. Now, for these sails, I felt it was necessary to double up the silkspan sheets, make them a bit more substantial. My usual practice when doing this is to mix the color first that I want using acrylics artist colors. Then I add about 30% by volume of white glue. This gets thoroughly mixed and applied to one of the sheets with a foam roller. The second sheet is laid right on top of the first, and more paint glue mix is applied. They're left to dry well, and then, with a fairly warm iron, the larger wrinkles are removed and the sheets are ironed flat. The patterns are transferred to the sheets. All the details like seams, tablings, and reinforcements are applied, and the sails are made ready to install. And again, a more complete description of the process can be seen at the links above and below. With the sails ready, they can be laced onto the spars. And here, the mainsail is being laced to a mast hoop. Now, it's hard to see in the video, but the pencil and pen marks you can see are not on the sail. That's a piece of drafting tape I've put on the edge so that I can mark out the locations of the mast hoops and any other details I need for installation. And then the reef points are put in, and here I'm wetting them down with some thinned white glue and weighting them down with clamps so they dry straight. When the model arrived at my studio, it was sitting loosely on a small cradle. Bayhead Historical wanted something that looked a bit more purpose-built and would make the model more secure. From white oak stock, I made a T-shaped base, and I decided to make two turn stanchions that would accept the keel and through which I could attach the model to the base with wood screws. Now, this alone was not going to provide the lateral support needed for so top-heavy a model. To address this, I made two floating supports that would give lateral stability amidships. These would go on the cross piece of the base, and since these two free-floating pieces could be moved around, they could also be used to help true the model up once it was permanently installed in the case. So the solution filled the need for lateral stability, plumb and square installation, and was visually minimally intrusive. This project offered no shortage of challenges. Most of them had to do with work performed on the model, the physical aspect of it. But there was one aspect of this project that had me considering one of the more abstract facets. That is, changing the physical appearance of an existing model, and thereby disregarding the intentions of the original builder. And it's the second part of that last sentence that had me a bit uneasy. I've spent most of my life repairing ship models where my intention is to have my work not be noticed. But this model took me far outside that. Now, I'm saying all this at the end of the document, so you know I've gone ahead with the project. So what could have made me comfortable enough to put my professional ethics off to one side and do this work? Well, the truth is, I didn't put my ethics off to the side. I re-examined them. And perhaps that re-examination has made them a little bit deeper and has allowed me to see more subtle shadings in the issues that I often come across. My reasoning went like this. This model of Embassy Berry was built from a kit. Its manufacturers did not set out to provide an historically accurate rendition of a particular vessel at a specific point in its life. Their intention was to produce a radio-controlled sailing model that looked reasonably like the real thing. Now, I'm going to make the very bold assumption here. That kit was bought by someone whose main intention was to simply have some fun building it, and maybe even take it for a sail in the pond. Or maybe it was just proudly displayed in their home. And while the model was in their possession, it fulfilled their intentions. Now it was in the possession of an historical society that had specific educational needs that this model, with some careful application of effort and alteration, could more than adequately meet. In my mind, there was no doubt that this work should be done. In fact, I consider not doing the work would be to squander a highly usable, or should I say reusable, resource. Now, I can hardly escape notice that what I did to this model bears more than a passing resemblance to what Slade Dale did for the real Embassy Berry when he rescued her off the mudflats in Maine. He rebuilt and repurposed her. He gave her a new and very useful life for the next 30 plus years. Hopefully, this model will share the same fate. History can repeat itself. Now, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below or feel free to contact me through my website, tjlauria.com/contact. And thanks for watching.